What happens when habitat quality declines substantially? The vital rates respond commensurately, and that's often because of elevated predation. So it makes sense that people would think when they see that predators are a
Oh,
problem.
that's a good
And if
point.
you don't take into consideration that habitat quality has declined, and that would return a higher predation rate, then it would look a lot like predators are the problem
Absolutely.
when it was actually the habitat underlying cause that forced the increase in predation.
Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
Well, it's been a active January. Yeah, we've kind of been feeling out what we're going to talk about on Wild Turkey Science in 2024. I did go back and listen to that other episode where I said, wait, did I say 2022? I did not. I was
Okay.
right on point.
I'm sure you slept
better
better once you figured that out. You're already Googling symptoms of early onset dementia. Confusing the year it is.
I am convinced that I am in that boat. Yeah. Well, we had some really good episodes already. Kind of got a vision plan for TFT. We also, our most recent episode, we talked about the habitat for the hatch. I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
And, I think we've got a really great plan for wild turkey science. And also, you and I both have been really active on social media trying to share research. Some of it we cover in the show, and some of it is not. I sometimes when I go through things, I kind of use that as I don't know, barometer, is that the right term, or thermometer to see how hot a topic can be.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like you kind of get a feel for whether or not people want you to talk about it and how much.
Yeah, I know that's interesting. I'm glad that you brought that up because I think it's obvious that we probably reach a lot of people with information on social media that we don't reach recording.
Yeah.
Or on the, for people listen. There's a lot of people on there that don't listen to the podcast probably, or they don't listen to every episode. So it's good to get information out that way too. But gosh darn, it's so hard to keep up with both that and this. And
know
I
it.
think what happened over the course of the last year, we had a lot of followers, probably mostly on Instagram. I think there's a lot on Facebook too. I started on Facebook, so I think I probably have a little bit more of a following there maybe than you do. But that maybe missed some of that content that we did before we started producing the show.
Yeah.
But it's hard to keep both up, man. It really is. And when we started the show, we started trying to share those blurbs, and we do little video clips of highlights from the shows to try to educate people within the video itself, and then also to drive them to listen to the entire episode and get the full story. And so that made it easy to kind of just disregard those posts that we made on a paper that came out or one that we dug up, and how that might relate to listeners.
Yeah. Well, I definitely, I think it's sort of like a knife's edge, right? You want it to tease people. That's the whole point of it. We were calling them teasers because we want you to kind of get a handle on what the content's going to be like, but not give it all away.
Yeah, sure.
To get people to come to the podcast because we want the podcast to grow. And I think, that's been a pretty good way to help grow it. But it's also
Mm-hmm.
clear, like you said, that not everybody is interacting in both cases. So you also want the reel to be informative and not misleading at the
Yeah.
same time to folks that only interact with the content there. So
Yeah, this is an interesting area to navigate in general, and I guess I'll just let a few folks in that are listening now in on my little secret that Marcus has like twisted my arm and convinced me to put all this information out there publicly on social media and podcasting and everything like that. This is not my jam. Like
it isn't mine either.
I'm very slow. I'm a very slow adopter of new technology, man. I
you know,
swear.
you know whose
It's
fault this is
like I got a
indirectly?
pair of Crocs 20 years after they came out.
Yeah, I don't even have a pair of Crocs.
Oh, see, you're 30 years behind.
I know. I mean, I saw. I don't recall where I saw it, but I saw that you can get all kinds of little pins and stuff that you can put in the
That's right.
Crocs now.
My
I saw
kids have
one that was
those.
like a boat propeller.
They have those. My
Like what?
kids have those all over there. But anyways, my point in saying this, because I was actually gonna give you a little pat on the back, but and relate this back to everything that we're trying to do here. Um, I don't like to self promote, but you have to self promote to get the message in front of more people.
Yeah.
And when we give a call for um, like reviews from listeners and things like that, it's because we're trying to get the content to more people. It
Well,
feels weird, but it's
yeah.
just kind of part of this process.
Well, and we've kind of talked about this. I'm the same way. Coming through academia, there really is this like stigma associated with it.
It is,
Like
yeah,
like it's all about self promotion and ego, and we're trying to get good information to as many people as possible, and that forces you into that uncomfortable place because, I mean, our colleagues in many cases view that negatively, and I think that's unfortunate. But uh, I deal with that. I know you have dealt with that with the folks on your faculty as well.
which is kind of really interesting because no one has a problem with you distributing flyers and trying to advertise like a
Yeah,
weekend workshop for landowners. But if you promote your podcast, then that's something different in their
yeah,
mind.
I don't understand why, but I think it is an interesting problem, but it also is super time consuming, and it's hard to balance. But I think we've proven that it's worth it, and a
Yeah,
lot of folks out there reaching out to us make me want to keep on.
yeah.
And it's
And there's
just
other people
time.
out there in this space that have zero qualms about self promotion that are also trying to spread a message. And sometimes, there's certain individuals that spread a message that's incorrect or, can
Yeah,
set people back in their management. So we have to try to compete with those people to get our
yeah,
our message out, which we think is, more objective and scientifically based.
yeah. Through some of we're trying to use some of the same technologies, I guess, to do
Right.
that. Well, yeah, I think that's part of the plan for 2024 with the podcast. We've been talking a lot. I mean, having people rate the podcast absolutely critical. It doesn't grow the algorithm basically, from what I can understand. Some guy in computer science taught me that word. Uh,
I use the
that
algorithm anytime. That is my word to describe an equation that I do not understand.
yeah, something behind the scenes is causing a computer to decide to push this in front of people that might like it that
Yeah.
aren't listening already. And I've been told that ratings do that.
Yeah. So
So,
anytime it tells you you may also like, or you type into that search box turkey, like all those sorts of
yeah,
things are where it probably would recommend us based on our
I
growth.
really want to be able to type in wild turkey into Google, and the first thing that comes up be wild turkey science, because I hope we're giving really good, solid information that everybody, you know, uh, needs to have easily accessible.
What do you,
Anyway, we're kind of running around circles. We've thought of some clever ways, and I would love feedback from the audience about this. But one of the things that some of our colleagues on other shows have done, and we've kind of been bouncing around this idea that maybe we could give away stuff, basically stuff in the hunting space. So you and I are both going to the convention. I think I'm presenting on Thursday the 14th, or no, the 15th, in that afternoon, and then you and I will both be around, probably stopping by several booths to talk to people. We'll put together some kind of schedule, I think, that we'll advertise through
closer to
social
time.
media and everything when we kind of get ironed out what we're going to do. So if you're going to the convention and you want to say hello or talk to us, keep a lookout for that. But one of the ideas that we had is maybe some of those vendors, we'll call them, that we interact with, maybe we can ask them for some cool gear that we could, share with people that rate the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one idea. We've got a couple of other interesting ones that I'm not going to disclose at the moment because I don't even know if you know, Will. One of them is a little bit sneaky, we'll just say. But anyway,
it probably involves putting me in some kind of compromising or embarrassing situation.
Yeah. So, folks out there, we appreciate all the support, and if you've already rated it, thanks. We'll include you, just like anyone who hasn't and goes on and does that, in opportunities for cool gear.
Yeah, and to clarify on that, we talked about this when we do start rolling that out. We plan to throw everybody that's already left us a review in the hat as well, so that we're not penalizing them for being some of our earlier reviewers. So we'll take anybody that leaves us a review. A lot of our listeners probably listen to Gamekeepers too. They kind of do the same thing, where they just throw names in the hat from their reviews, and then they call it out on the air, and you have to claim it.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think all of that to say, I think the convention is really a good time marker right there in mid-February when people really shift focus to turkeys and there's a lot of enthusiasm and excitement. We have the greatest potential to grow the show so that we can continue it, basically. If we're not growing, we're dying, right? So, that I think the timing is right to try to do that, and that's one thing we need to do. So we're trying to come up with clever ways to make sure we take advantage of the enthusiasm, and ultimately, I think it's going to be positive for turkeys, assuming that the science on turkeys is good for turkeys. So that being said, I did the survey that we've been tagging in. I did kind of go through and see just a ballpark right now. It's still out. If folks haven't taken it, you can still take it. We'll have it in the show notes. But just trying to quantify the impact in terms of acres. And we're on up there in 7 digits now.
Nice.
And those are all on the left side of the decimal point.
I'm glad you clarified that.
Is pretty incredible. And hopefully, people are getting a lot out of this and they're applying it to acreage.
Yeah.
For the benefit of turkeys. And that's what we're here for.
That's right.
That said, I think we just rambled on for more than 10 minutes about what the topic we were going to get to today is.
Yeah, so before we jump on that, can I make one other little quick announcement?
Oh, man, I knew you were going to do that to me. That's why.
So we just talked about the convention. I'm not going to sidetrack us for long, but we just talked about the convention. The end of last week, I committed to another event for my local, like Auburn, East Alabama people here that they might want to attend. I'm going to be at the Turkeys for Tomorrow fundraiser banquet in Auburn on March 14th. That's the evening of March 14th. There's going to be a banquet that's here local. I'm going to get up and just talk a little bit about, how TFTs helped me do some of my work in the past couple of years, and what that's going to look like going forward. Talk a little bit about some of the things that we've discovered from that research. So if you're
Nice.
around and you're interested, I know we have a lot of listeners in Alabama specifically, and even more specifically in the Auburn Opelika area. Come on out.
Nice.
That's
That's
March
on March
14th.
14th.
Yeah.
Sweet. So a little bit farther down the road, but still right in the golden time.
There you go. So before I so rudely interrupted, our topic for today.
Now you're going to interrupt me again to note how rude you were interrupting me. Yeah.
Only if you get it wrong.
So you shared a paper with me first, and then I remember responding to you like, this is really great information. And then I think I asked you, are you going to do a post on this? Because that's the other thing we're trying to communicate to make sure that we don't undercut each other. And then I generally do that as well. As you know, if you've followed me on social media for quite a while now, I've been sharing just stuff that's relevant to whom I think my audience is. And a lot of the work is not from my lab. So I kind of reach out to the authors to make sure they don't have something in the works, especially if it's hot off the press. But yeah, so you ended up developing a really good post, basically looking at the effectiveness of trapping.
Yeah, and as an FYI, if the production quality doesn't reflect it, that post that I made last week on raccoon trapping probably has 5 hours of my time invested in
it. Oh man!
And I would like
it was good.
I would like to say that only 30 minutes of that time went into actually making the post in Instagram, but it was probably more like 2 hours making the post in Instagram, editing it, and then 3 hours prior to that taking notes and reading to make sure I had everything right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's reached quite a few people, so I think it was worth it. And it's also really good information. And I don't think it would get out there if we weren't doing that. I mean, I know other people do stuff like this, but I've never seen some of that information. Yeah. So I thought it was really interesting. We'll link it in the show notes if you didn't get to see, if you want to see the we'll quote quality of Will's production, but and plus it's just really good information.
And so it showed that you could reduce raccoon populations by as much as 90% using trapping, but that spurred, and we'll get back to that, but that spurred additional online discussion about the role of trapping versus habitat in wild turkey management, and why are we so willing to stand firmly behind habitat management and less so behind using predator control as a wild turkey management strategy.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I posted something recently, and I even got another couple of comments, one in particular that was essentially what you just said. We're sitting here saying we don't have the data needed where we have a manipulative habitat project that we can equate to a change in vital rates so that it is a causative effect.
Mm-hmm.
And we also have spoken several times about the lack of that same data for trapping.
Right.
Yet we very commonly promote habitat management and then are very cautious about trapping. In fact, I think, the way that I've heard you say it, and I've probably said it at some point, we're habitat first. That doesn't mean you don't trap at all, but you do that when habitat is in order. We say things like that. And I think there's still some confusion as to why we are willing. We say that from a non-scientist standpoint, the same data is missing on both.
Yeah.
But we kind of have this unequal treatment of the two topics. And frankly, I think that's got to be the topic on social media that really just causes division and gets people mad.
Yeah, I mean,
Like I
sometimes
saw in
it
your
doesn't.
post that your post was kind of positive toward trapping,
Right.
and there were still a bunch of people that really got bent out of shape about it.
Yeah, and
Like you
I
were
mean,
being
even
negative
told
about trapping.
and even asked me why I'm always so dismissive and negative about trapping in a couple instances.
Yeah.
So,
So, but you shared, and same thing I did when I was just sharing like a coyote diet, and
yeah,
you shared that turkeys were a, a good solid proportion of it,
right.
uh, and to me that kind of paints a picture that predators eat turkeys. We all know that, and that in some cases they could be a limiting factor. And then your paper shows that
Had nothing to
trapping
do
in
with
some
turkeys.
contexts
Had
do
nothing
what?
to do with turkeys.
Was that?
My paper, the one
Yeah, it
that I
was trapping
reviewed,
raccoon.
it was
Yeah.
just yeah.
Well, I think that's where the reservation came in.
Mhm.
That paper demonstrated really well that trapping, which we'll get into the details in a few minutes, but trapping can cause a substantial decline in raccoon abundance. But you also caveated the limitations of that, like the time frame and the scale, and the fact that trapping causing a decline in raccoons doesn't necessarily equate to a change in turkey vital rates.
Yeah, I think it was that disclaimer at the end and in some of my replies to
Yeah,
comments that got me in trouble with certain
right.
followers.
But
Um,
you did what you were supposed to. You didn't extrapolate what they actually measured to what
yeah,
the the outcome is,
right.
because they didn't measure that outcome, and that's what we
Yeah.
keep going back to.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know. I always like coming up with analogies, you know that, and I'm trying to.
Yeah.
In the process of you talking just then, I was trying to come up with one, and I guess I did somewhat. I don't know how helpful it's going to be, so if it is,
Uh,
keep it. If not, just discard it like 90% of what I say. But um, you think about it. We're scientists. That's our job. Your doctor, it's their job to follow the science related to medicine, right? So when they
mhm.
give you a drug to treat a symptom or a disease that you have, it is their job to tell you, how it can potentially reduce that symptom or cure that disease. But what else do they tell you a lot of times?
All the other
Yeah,
consequences.
everything else that comes along with it, right? And
Well,
so
yeah, I think that's a great analogy.
that's
So,
kind of what we're
yeah,
doing here.
it's like saying, "Okay, well, we can give you this drug, and it's really good at stopping
Hmm.
this problem that has this much risk to death,
Yeah.
but it causes all these other things that increase your risk of death to so that it's basically the same."
Yeah. And I
Right.
even said that in one of my replies to a comment on that post is I'm not trying to tell anyone what to do or not to do, right?
Mhm.
Legal or illegal. I'm not a game board neither. I'm a scientist, right? Like I'm not telling
It's
anybody
none of my business.
what they
Please
should be
don't tell me if
doing.
you're doing something illegal.
Yeah, but it is my job. It is my job to create informed conservationists, and that's all I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
And without that information and without understanding the context, you can misapply the study, you can misinterpret it, and then that translates into less effective management and potentially more costly management. So that's really all that we're trying to do. If I thought, I mean, seriously, right now, if I thought that there were no downsides to trapping and that everybody who trapped was also capable, because not everybody's capable of managing their habitat. We get that a lot too. We've talked about,
Mhm.
how to, potentially circumvent that. In some cases you can't. But um but if you've addressed your habitat and that's in great shape, and the reason I bring that up first is kind of going to be the whole focus of today's episode, right? But if you've addressed that first and you're not directing time or other resources away from that, and you're coming into trapping with your eyes wide open, having realistic expectations for what you're actually likely to accomplish or achieve in enhancing a turkey population, 100% do it. I don't want people to, at the risk of of people misinterpreting what I'm about to say as an admonition to go out and trap. I am going to be trapping here pretty soon. Um, but the place that I am going to be trapping has 99% of the other work already done, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not, in doing so, taking away from any of that. Like, if I have an afternoon that I can go set more traps, or there's a plot, or there's a stand on the property that needs to get burned, I'm going to go burn. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not going to, to go waste time with trapping when I can burn.
Well, I think another thing, as soon as someone publishes a good, solid, replicated experiment demonstrating that trapping equates to some change in vital rate, positive or negative, I don't care. You and I will be racing to see who can get that out to people first.
Yeah, sure.
It's, I mean, seriously, it's what you said. We are sharing data.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that has piqued the interest of many turkey enthusiasts. And if the data becomes available, we'll be the first ones in line to get it out to people.
Right.
So, but I really think that we should kind of discuss this from a different context. As we talked, I mean, we had a series on predators and predator trapping. We've had a series more specific to habitat. We've really given a broad argument, I guess, on the pros and cons and what we know about each of them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but I think that we need to discuss why we're more comfortable promoting the habitat side and why biologists are in
Yeah.
general, because that's the common, you know, discussion point, right?
Yeah.
Is
Well,
that all biologists have kind of gotten in this, I don't know, conspiracy or something. I don't know what the right word is.
that's
Probably shouldn't.
definitely a thing that they think that, biologists, when we're handed our degrees walking across the stage, we're told, now you always have to promote habitat over predator control.
Yeah.
It's not like that, but really what drives it, I think, at the foundation of all of this is the knowledge that habitat management can affect all aspects of life history. It can affect pretty much every single vital rate. There's some things that'll happen
Hmm.
independently of habitat. Like disease may be a good example of that, but one could even counter and say that by having better habitat and better body condition that stems from that at an individual level, that those individuals that are infected are less susceptible to diseases, right?
Hmm.
So it's you can connect habitat to all aspects of life history, to almost every single vital rate that we calculate, whereas predator control oftentimes only benefits either survival at the adult age class or at the juvenile or the egg class, right? For in the case of
Hmm.
turkeys.
Yeah, I think those are good points. So, uh, we we have characterized the literature, and I think one of the problems that is the case with both topics, we don't have a well replicated manipulative study in a spatial and temporal scale that shows applying habitat management or applying trapping, intensive trapping, whatever that looks like for you.
Yeah.
We don't have the experiment that you and I want to actually show what that confers in terms of a vital rate response.
Right.
So, an increase in nesting success or an increase in hen survival or whatever the metric.
Ideally, one that shows how those translate into the annual population growth rate.
Right.
Because that's the real gold standard, right?
Yeah. So, when we
Let's
had Chitwood on, he was talking about that life stage analysis that incorporates all those vital rates that show you can, basically predict the population trajectory. What the holy grail is for either of those practices is to have an experimental design where we can assign causation to habitat manipulation or predator removal, either one, and show how that changes the trajectory of the population.
Yeah.
That's
Because believe it or not, there's potential, and we're going to use the word compensatory a lot today, so I might as well get that out of the way, right? But the reason that we would want to see how that translates into annual population growth is because believe it or not, there are experiments, not necessarily with turkeys, that show that more eggs hatching doesn't always equate to more individuals recruited into the fall population, for example.
Right.
Because they
not
die
a bad thing
at other places, right?
Yeah. It's probably not a bad thing, but if they die for another reason, it didn't help any.
It didn't help.
Yeah, so
I think before you go any further, you'll really appreciate this because this hits right on that point where I was going through one of these meta-analyses today, right?
Okay, which one?
And this is man, why did you have to why can't we just link it in the show notes?
I need to hear you say it. For the record out there, I don't know what he's about to say. I don't know which paper he's talking about.
All right, I'm just going to put on my big boy pants and just spit this one out. Lazur and Wallagi.
Wallagi?
Wallagi is spelled Weladji.
J-I?
Yeah, and I happen to remember his first name was Robert. So Robert, if I had mispronounced your last name, I'm sorry. I didn't get your first name wrong.
I think does the J make an H sound there?
Maybe.
I could see that you just like paused trying to think that through.
If you put two consonants side by side that I'm not used to seeing arranged that way, I'm going to get it wrong 10 times out of 10.
Yeah. Well, it's close enough. So what'd they say?
So they said, so in this paper, it was a meta-analysis looking at different ways to mitigate different types of conflicts that people have with mesopredators, these mid-sized predators that oftentimes are our nest predators, like raccoons, possums, and foxes, right?
Just to clarify out there, a meta-analysis essentially means that they did a review of all the literature they could find within the scope of their topic.
Right.
And then they basically standardize them in a modeling effort to see the overall effect of some practice or treatment or whatever.
Yeah, and this paper just came out in 2023, so it's very recent. And to your point about experimental design and us just wanting to, see the one study that meets all these criteria related to wild turkeys. Okay. The bar for their study was much lower than that because it didn't have to pertain to wild turkeys. It was just any study that had tried to solve any human wildlife conflict of any type related to raccoons, foxes, possums, and skunks. Okay.
Yeah.
And they noted that in the studies that they reviewed, that many of those suffered from a lack of validation through experimental approach. Specifically, they said research would benefit from repeated studies using the same methods in similar context, and that they had to exclude 62% of the studies they found because of issues with the study design, choice of treatments, or the goal of the study. So, I mean, just right then and there, they reviewed
over half of the studies.
They reviewed the dealing with predators literature and found over half of it was problematic and couldn't be included because of poor design or other factors. So, I mean, that really gives you kind of an appreciation of the scope and scale of this problem that we're talking about in the literature.
Yeah, I think it's particularly pronounced for turkeys, but and for not just predators, but for habitat as well. But it makes sense that it would be because, the scale at which you have to do things spatially and temporally is so daunting often.
Right.
So, okay.
I just wanted to bring that one up. I thought you'd really appreciate that because it hammers home a point that you make often.
What was the point I make?
That there's a lack of well replicated and executed experiments.
Yeah.
On the topic of predator
it's
control.
Just like in our discipline too. It's not just.
Yeah.
That is frustrating to me.
All right. So we already talked about one reason that we're habitat first.
Mm-hmm.
And that being that, you stand to benefit the population from a greater number of not perspectives, but you stand to benefit the population much more holistically with habitat than you do with just predator control. If we're making it an either or thing, and it doesn't,
Mm-hmm.
maybe that's a false dichotomy that a lot of people create for argument's sake, and I shouldn't play into that, but um, there were two papers that really stood out to me when I was preparing for this episode today, and I'll go ahead and let everybody down by saying that these are northern bobwhite quail papers. All right, these aren't turkey papers, but just appreciate the similarities that they do have to turkeys. They're in the same geographical area that we want to generally that we're seeing declines in wild turkey populations, the same suite of predators, the same management alternatives available to the managers in those situations, and we're also dealing with a ground nesting bird.
Yep, they're both gallinaceous, I guess, game birds.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a lot of similarities. They have some obvious differences, like their size and their mating
Yeah,
system, and there's plenty of differences, but they also have a lot of similar characteristics.
right. So the first one that I wanted to mention, and to be clear, we have discussed both of these papers on the podcast before, not maybe as directly or in the context that we're about to do today, but we have talked about them a little bit before. Mainly, I think you talked about them, Marcus, and so maybe my interpretation of them will help some people that aren't as smart as you because I'm not. So, having that different perspective always helps a little bit too.
Man, you're really laying it on today, aren't you?
I have to translate things into Alabamas to understand them. So what does that say about me? Okay, so the first one was by Bill Palmer and others, published back in 2010, and they had this field border experiment where they had these agricultural farms, these row crop farms in North Carolina. Specifically, they had 12 farms that were part of the study, so pretty good replication. And that's something that a lot of these other studies lack. But what they were interested in determining is what happens to the number of coveys that they're able to count. Covey call counts is a very accepted and
Mhm.
widely used method of indexing quail populations. And they wanted to ask the question of how those covey counts change in response to the implementation of native plant communities, allowing native plant communities to grow along the edges of fields. So they call that the field border practice, which is one that's commonly implemented using some of our habitat programs under U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or underneath the Farm Bill. I'm sorry. And they wanted to also at the same time take advantage of that opportunity to compare it to just implementing predator control for quail, right? And so,
Okay, so typical ag landscape, North Carolina,
mm-hmm,
and you've got a field board practice versus the landowner's just going to implement aggressive trapping.
that's right. So this was one thing that was interesting to me that they mentioned in that study, and I don't know if we've covered it before, but they reported that the field borders were dominated, that they allowed to regrow, right, to naturally
Mhm.
revegetate, as Craig would say, were dominated by goldenrod, giant cane, blackberry, various Lespedeza species, wax myrtle, and dog fennel. So these are not like some super specialized, very intensively managed plant communities for quail,
Yeah.
right? This is just stuff that you get back no matter
Well, I
what
would
you
have
do.
if I went out there and looked at that, I'd be like, we probably got a little ways to go.
Yeah, I mean it depends on the
I mean, if you got
structure of that cover, but you wouldn't be
yeah,
super impressed if you saw plant
yeah.
communities dominated by that. That's
Well,
everywhere.
if you're naming wax myrtle and baccharis and stuff like that as a principal component of the plant community, no, I would not be ready to say we're done.
Well, let's see how you feel about it after I share with you this statistic. All right. So they measured they did the covey call counts during a 3-year period after the treatments were implemented. It's my understanding that they didn't do any covey call counts before, treatments. There was no pre-treatment data, but they had instead they had control areas where they did neither action. So they didn't implement field borders and they didn't implement predator control. And so the baseline covey call count on farms that had neither treatment was 3.6 covey calls. Okay, over the 3-year period. I averaged across all 3 years because there was a little bit of up and down, just like we see in turkey reproduction. You're going to get that annual variation that's due to factors that are outside of our control, right? Things like weather, for example. All right, so 3.6 on the farms that had neither. That increased to an average of 4.53 on the areas that they allowed those field borders to grow up. Okay.
3.6 to 4.5.
Yeah, so that's like a 26% increase, right? An absolute increase. I mean, technically that's 126% of the baseline. So it's the baseline plus 26%. Okay. On the site where they just did predator control, they actually had a reduction in the number of covey calls that they counted by about 10%. So it went down from 3.6 covey calls on average per farm to 3.2 on average per farm.
Okay. What did they have a control area that they continued to do nothing on?
Yes, that was the baseline. What they were calling the baseline, where they did neither action.
Oh, okay. This isn't a before baseline. It's a
right. It's concurrent with treatments.
Okay.
Yeah, the baseline is concurrent with treatments.
So the trapping. Let me get this straight. They went in there and started trapping aggressively
on these farms.
No habitat work with that. Just
ag fields in eastern North Carolina.
And they got less quail.
They counted fewer quail on average over a 3-year period.
That doesn't sound very good.
Yeah, I wouldn't put too much stock in the in trapping leading to a reduction. It was statistically different than the baseline, but I don't know. I'm not looking at that number and automatically concluding that just trapping is going to actually reduce quail populations.
Yeah, but what you can pretty confidently say is it didn't increase it.
Pretty confidently.
Okay.
Okay. Right. So you compare that to the sites where they did both. They allowed the field borders to revegetate. They took them out of production. They let them grow up in all this beautiful blackberry, wax myrtle, and dog fennel. And then they also trapped. And so they went from the baseline on average of 3.6 coveys up to 5.6 coveys. So that's about a 56% increase from baseline.
Now the effect size is doubled from just habitat.
Yeah. But if we're
and again, this isn't even landscape scale habitat. We're literally talking about 10-yard wide borders on the fields.
Yeah, pretty much.
I mean,
I don't remember the specific.
I guess the habitat effect size, I suspect, would have been larger had it been more of the landscape, because the landscape was still largely uninhabitable.
Right.
The agricultural part. I mean.
Right. Sure.
So the field borders had, you see a 26% response, but then you add trapping in, and it doubles that.
Right. But if you just trap, because remember the dichotomy, it seems like that we often get drawn into debating is habitat versus predator control, and just predator control without habitat didn't benefit the population, may have hurt it.
Yeah, it certainly didn't benefit it.
Just habitat.
Now, I think we're going to go into some reasons how it actually could
be negative,
but
we will.
And we have before as well. But we can pretty confidently say in a pretty solid study, it sounds like, that it didn't benefit it.
Yeah.
Unless the habitat was in good shape.
If the
And then the
habitat was in
benefit was
good
big.
shape, maybe it doubles your effect over baseline.
So there's a couple other things I wanted to talk about that came to mind when we're talking about this. So think about those field borders. I have this conversation with people a lot. I think it's intuitive to people out there that when your target species, in this case quail, it doesn't matter though, it could be turkeys or whatever, when they are relegated to long linear features for nesting or brooding or whatever,
That's
they're
a good point.
probably more vulnerable.
That's a good point.
Right? So, well, they're not more vulnerable than they would be with nothing, but they're still more vulnerable than they would be if it was shaped or oriented differently, probably.
Right.
And there's some stuff in the bird literature to show this well, that the long linear features are easy to hunt, basically.
Right.
So that probably suppressed the effect size of habitat some, because it is problematic from a predation standpoint, but it's
Well, it's
better than
efficient.
nothing.
The patches they created around the field borders, like you accurately pointed out, are easy to search. I think also we need to talk about the limited availability of that cover type across the landscape too.
Right.
There's not a whole lot of it, and what we
Yeah.
have is long and linear.
Right. So, but long and linear is better than none.
Exactly.
So that's what the habitat treatment is
Clearly.
showing you.
Clearly, yeah.
Yeah. That's what it's showing you. And then it probably also magnified the effect of trapping
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, because predation should be at its maximum limiting when you have enough habitat, but it's super easy to hunt.
Yeah.
So, that I think that's important to think about when you're thinking about those studies, that it is designed to maximize the effectiveness of the two together.
Right. Absolutely. So whenever this conversation comes up, that's one study obviously that's going to come to mind for me. The other one that you've mentioned and pointed out is a great resource, published by Rader and others. That's RADER, not RAID.
Yeah, and we're saying the names not just so that we can pick at Will for his pronunciation, but
Yeah,
also
but that
so
is
that
fun.
Charlotte can find them and list them in our show notes. So if you want to go read these studies,
Right.
we're trying to make them available to you.
Yeah. So this study in particular is not going to be as directly, I think, applicable to a lot of our listeners because it was done in South Texas, which is a very extreme environment. We've talked about it before on here before. It's semi-arid, very small deviations, either positive or negative in rain from the rainfall average, has a profound effect on upland game bird populations there, on wildlife populations as a whole. So this is less about trying to give you guys actionable information and more about highlighting trends that we see, right? And so what they were specifically interested in the Rader study was the relative impact of changing the nest predation rate, right? So they use predator control for that. But they also wanted to look at how nesting habitat played into population growth, again with quail, like in the previous study. And then finally, they also wanted to look at the role that weather played because of the environmental context that we just talked about. So within weather, they were specifically interested in temperature and precipitation deviations. Okay, so I'll jump down to kind of like the brass tacks findings of the study, and then we can go back and fill in any necessary details based on what you want to talk about afterwards. But they did this. One other thing that is important to point out is that they did it using a simulation model, and that's just they build this model in a computer and they allow the population to either grow, shrink, or stay the same based on the values that they give it. But so some people, might right off the bat say, well, this is a computer model, it's a simulation, it's not very relevant to real world scenarios. But all of the vital rates that went into that model were taken from data that they actually collected from the field or that other people had already taken and collected from the field previously. So they were using real estimates of what is survival like with predator control, without predator control, with this habitat versus that habitat configuration, and so on and so forth. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. So in other words, while a model that's parameterized with stuff we made up might produce some squirrely results.
Or whatever we wanted it to.
This one had real data from the field that was used to construct it.
Yeah, they said based model parameters on data collected from a 3-year nest predator study that they did, from ongoing field research using tagged quail, and from the literature. All right. So now that that's out of the way, under the scenario where they looked at the effect of predator control and then they modeled the population out, I think they went 10 years in this particular study. Different studies, they used different time durations. But under just predator control, the population increased by about 55% from the baseline scenario, whereas under the scenario where they were
10 years?
What's that? Over 10 years. Yeah.
Okay.
So it increased
55% bigger after 10 years. Okay.
So if we started with 100 quail in year 10, we'd have 155 quail, right? So in contrast to that, they looked at nest clump availability. That was kind of like their big habitat metric. And so for nest clumps, what they were primarily referring to were like these clumps of probably a mixture of, it mostly had like native warm season grasses that have the clumps at the base that quail will use to nest in. But they were probably mixed in with various woody and other herbaceous species. But these are basically just the clumps that they have identified and that are well established in the quail literature in that part of the world to provide nesting cover for quail. So in the scenario where they reduced nest clump availability, in contrast, populations decreased about 75% from the baseline. So over a 10-year period, just predator control, you got about a 55% increase versus if you start taking those nest clumps away, and they didn't take them all away. I can't remember, what the exact number was, but they made sure it was a reasonable number based on the range of conditions that they saw in their study areas. The population decreased by 75% over that 10-year period.
So you don't know what proportion they took away?
No, I didn't remember picking up on that detail when I read it.
Okay, I'm sure it's in the
paper. That's what ticks me off is every time I review these papers, I feel like I get all the pertinent details in there, and then when I start reading it back, I'm like, shoot, I didn't get that.
Yeah. Well, so in other words, they were manipulating availability of nesting by taking away nesting cover.
Yeah, so they were simulating. I know this. I don't know the percentage they decreased it by, but what they were doing is they were plugging in different nest clump availability that represented the variation of the sites that they collected data from. Okay. So it was real world variation. Some sites had a lot of nest clumps. So it wasn't like they were in the
field mowing down all the nest clumps. They were actually just plugging it into the model.
That's right. That's right. They had these sites that they had collected data from. Some of them maybe had 10 nest clumps per acre, and some of them maybe had 100. Who knows what the actual number was, but that's the range that they modeled across. Okay. Yeah. So kind of just tying all these results together, the comparisons among scenarios showed that reduced nest clump availability, low rainfall, and high temps, we hadn't even talked about the weather stuff yet, reduced bobwhite densities more than did natural nest predation rates that they saw on those sites. Overall, reduced nest clump availability resulted in the greatest decline of bobwhite densities.
So really, the way that you presented it is sort of counterintuitive for me to understand.
My brain works differently, I guess.
Well, no, I think it's the way they did it. Like, I don't understand. Why didn't they show how increasing nesting cover
I know.
increased the population to compare it to the trapping, which
I
was
know. I
that
know.
would have
I
been
see what you're
easier to
saying
wrap
now.
your head around. But okay. So basically, the habitat and weather, big time effect on the population that superseded what could be accomplished, or in other words, it couldn't be countered.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have bad in that environment, it's also extreme environment.
Yeah.
So let's just make that clear. The no rainfall is such an extreme environment for anything to live in.
Yeah.
So, yeah, basically, if the weather wasn't going right and you're losing the habitat at the same time, trapping is not going to turn that around.
That's right.
It might slow it down some.
Right.
But it's not going to turn it around. Okay.
But in the other study, in the North Carolina study, trapping alone didn't just not turn it around; it made it worse.
Yeah.
I'm not, like I said, I'm not hanging my hat on that, but it definitely did not help.
Well, I think that gives you confidence that you can say it didn't work.
Yeah. Now, if they had, a causal mechanism to explain why it would reduce, the quail population, then I'd be more likely to support that.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't see one proposed there.
Yeah.
So those are kind of like, again, not perfect, not with turkeys, but those are two really well done and designed and implemented studies on an upland game bird that show a greater effect of habitat and probably a more consistent positive effect of habitat than there is of just predator control.
So there's a couple of things that came to mind for me. One, I wonder if we have less. I bet we have less good data. I'm talking about just species wide globally. I wonder if we have less high quality replicated habitat experiments equating to a vital rate response than we do predator removal.
Probably.
I bet we do.
I
I'd
bet we
like to see
probably
that.
do. Yeah, I mean, just think
It's
about.
so hard to find a manipulative habitat study on any species. Really, it's incredibly difficult.
Yeah, and I mean, that goes back to the meta-analysis, whose authors I won't name again because they're probably already angry at me. But
Email will.
even though they had to exclude 62% of the studies that they found, they still were able to locate 218 experiments from 148 different published sources dealing with human conflicts with mesopredators in some
Mhm.
capacity. And they specifically said in that paper that most of the conflicts were with consumption of a wildlife species by that mesopredator.
Yeah.
So that gives you a kind of an appreciation and understanding for the number of those types of studies that are out there compared to, let's measure vital rates in response to, how much
Mhm.
ragweed we have or something along those lines.
Well, so a couple of those studies you drilled in on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the one that you shared online recently with the
Mm-hmm.
raccoons. We
Yeah.
never did drill in on that.
No, we didn't.
I think it shows you something pretty important. Uh, in terms of how effective trapping could be for nest predators.
Right.
Under ideal circumstances, at least.
It does. And I'm happy to get into that. But one thing that I will mention before we do is that they found, let me find it. Instead of going with a direct quote, I will mention that in that meta analysis article, they did discover that there was a strong bias towards publishing studies that actually showed a positive outcome of predator control measures. So that means that there aren't a lot of studies out there that are showing little to no effect that are actually published. That's an important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah. Is that because there's bias against publishing things that are negative results, or because they always show positive results?
They said that now you're really asking me to stretch my memory, but I think there's typically, with any study that we implement, there does tend to be a publication bias towards those that actually show some significant outcome, that the tested
Mhm.
hypothesis was true, or what they
Yeah.
hypothesized was actually true. So, in general, I would expect that to probably be the case here, where most people aren't trying as hard or trying at all, even to publish negative or unequivocal, or yeah, equivocal results.
Mhm.
Okay,
Yep,
so now
that's
that
a
we
good
got that out
point.
of the way, I'm sure there was one person that probably wanted to hear that, so I'm glad I got it out.
We do have, like, 3 scientists that listen to us.
Yeah. So
Chitwood told me the other day that he loves hearing his name dropped in here, so there you go, Chitwood. There's you another one.
Chitwood. I was gonna bring him up in a minute. You got out of order.
Uh,
So, because some of his work is relevant to this conversation, but in that
mhm.
meta-analysis study that we just got done talking about, it referenced a couple of articles related to raccoon control. Okay, um, and specifically, they reported, and these are kind of the statements that got me to dig deeper and got me really interested in this. They generally found that lethal control is the most commonly tested method and is generally effective at reducing conflicts based on the calculated effect size. And then they went on to mention that it does tend to be particularly effective for raccoons. And then they cited this study, which was published by here we go again. It's spelled like Rosette, but the first E is an A instead of an E. How would you pronounce that? Rosatte.
Rosate?
That's what I was thinking. I was gonna put a little Italian flair on there.
Well, I was just thinking it's in Canada, right? So there's probably some French influence or something.
Rosate. That's where I was going, but I didn't want to sound like an idiot, so I'm glad you did first.
It sounds like a delicious meal to me.
Rosate.
I was going to stop
Or
by the store and
maybe
get some
that's what
rosate on the
rosé.
way home.
Maybe that's what rosé is short for. It's actually rosate.
Rosate. Oh, that's
Do you think we
hilarious.
have any sommeliers listening to this podcast? Do you think they're offended right now?
You know, we get like 10 downloads a week in France. So
Oh
somebody
boy. Oh man. I might get hung up at the border next time I try. No. All right. So in this particular study, they were trying to keep raccoon rabies out of Canada, and they
sounds like a
had,
good idea.
yeah, noble cause, right? And so they had 3 detections of raccoon rabies in Ontario, and they implemented this strategic plan to try to limit its distribution and prevalence. Okay, so essentially they had these areas that were right around where the case was discovered, where they killed every raccoon that they possibly could. Um, it was the 3 of these areas added up to about 18,500 acres, which is just short of 30 square miles an area. Okay.
30 square miles.
Mm-hmm.
Got it. That's pretty big.
That's a big area to trap. Across that 30 square miles, they deployed all tomahawk cage traps at a density of 1 per 25 acres.
1 per 25 acres?
For 14 nights.
For 2 weeks, 1 per 25 acres and 30 square miles. How many traps is that?
A lot.
How many Alabamas?
A lot.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So,
all right. So this, it's a huge area. We've already talked about that being one of the things that's necessary, right? Especially with turkeys, we're not often operating at a scale. In that case, they were, where they could have a population level, which they didn't track turkeys. This wasn't for turkeys. It was for rabies. And that's one of the caveats here. We don't, I mean, that ought to be like, according to some, that should be like the turkey capital of the world now.
Right. I did the math for you. That's 740 cage traps.
Dang.
Yeah.
All right.
I did. I will take a minute to note here that one of the comments on my Instagram post that I did on this paper said that they weren't putting out enough traps. So,
well, if you've got 120 acres, you can certainly do more than that at that scale. But you also probably need more because of the problems with immigration that could come. But they don't have that problem here.
And that's a very important point that I'm going to get back to in just a second. So, all right, 100. Let's see, 100 live traps for 2,500 acres. That comes out to 1 per 25 acres. It resulted in the euthanasia of 1,200 raccoons that were captured. Their estimates, so they were doing like mark recapture population estimates, right? They reduced the density from an estimated 13 to 18 raccoons per square mile. So that's their baseline population was somewhere in the neighborhood of like 15 coons per square mile. And with that trap density across that area, they reduced it to about in the low twos number per square mile. So like 1.6 to 2.8 raccoons per square mile. So that's about a 90% reduction in the population density.
90%. That sounds good.
That sounds really good. One thing that is interesting about that I think for anybody that did decide to implement predator control for mesopredators as a management option on their property is that they found that they removed about 80% of those animals within about the first week. So, going for that second week only got them up to about an additional 10% of the population removed.
Yeah. So it's like a diminishing return, which makes sense. You catch all the dumb ones first and then starts getting a little more difficult.
But a caveat there, like you pointed out earlier, this is a huge area. If it was a much smaller area and you have new individuals constantly immigrating after taking the old ones out, maybe it would take longer to knock it down that much. Anyway, this is what was really interesting. This perfectly relevant to that point we just talked about is that based on the movements of raccoons that they had tagged with transmitters in the surrounding area, so they had a containment zone outside the trapping zone that was not trapped, and they tagged coons there, and they didn't see that there was an uptick of those coons immigrating into the trapped area after the removal had occurred.
Man, you remember talking about how we wanted to do that study?
Yeah.
Golly. Yeah. Okay, so they had a bunch of GPS tags on them all around the 30-mile radius.
Yeah.
And they did not go in.
No, they found that most of those raccoons had a high degree of sight fidelity. They weren't really making any long distance movements or anything like that would have led them to enter that vacated area. And if you think about it, if you're in a scenario where you're a raccoon living in one area and you have all the resources you need, why would you go out looking for an area that has a lower population density and more food resources? I don't think you necessarily would, unless the area where you're at is, at some point beyond the inflection point where you're starting to push into carrying capacity and resources are becoming more limited, right?
Yeah, which I don't know if this is the case or not, but it also seems a little bit counterintuitive that we would say, oh, well, turkeys might avoid an area that has a lot of predators, but when raccoons are getting killed left and right and you got dead cousins and brothers and sisters laying around everywhere, the raccoons may not want to go in there because it's scary.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Well,
Like, hey,
let's think about this
we used
another
to have
way.
all my cousins over there keeping us out of there, but now they're all gone.
Yeah.
Is that a red flag? I don't know.
Well, let's think about this another way too. It's a lot easier to know what your neighbor has, right? Resource wise, than it is to know what somebody that lives, a few miles down the road from you has.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the scenario that we're painting here, and why scale matters so much is that those raccoons around the periphery of the trap zone have no idea what's going on inside the center of that trap zone, and it's 30 miles squared, So it
Mm-hmm.
may be, depending on where they are, they may have to travel 30 miles to get to the dead center, or 15 miles to get to the dead center of that square.
Yeah.
They have no idea what resources are available there.
That's a good point.
But if you're trapping your back 40, chances are there's a coon next door that knows what food resources and what potential mates are in that area if you take out the head boar coon,
Mm-hmm.
and they might want to move in on that.
Maybe I still think there's room for more work on this.
Absolutely.
For sure. But
absolutely.
Okay, so intensive trapping, large scale, 2-week time period, lots of raccoons moved.
90% reduction in the
Yeah, which
population.
they had marked ones in the population, so they had a pretty robust estimate of how much it declined. So that's good.
I don't want to gloss over this part because this is something that really stood out to you the first time that we talked about this, that you reacted to. And just because we've covered it before, I don't want to miss it here. It's incredible to me that actually, let me back up. I'm getting ahead of myself here. I'm sorry, everybody. They did a follow-up paper that we need
I was
to talk.
just about to ask you about this. So I was not letting this go. I think that's what I was trying to give a recap.
Yeah.
Of we got it down. So now what?
Okay.
I think that's where you're going.
Yeah. So they did a follow-up paper because they were interested to see how quickly did the population bounce back. For their purposes, it had disease implications. In the context that we're discussing this, it would have turkey, nest implications potentially. All right, so they published a paper after that as a follow-up, and they found that the population of raccoons in those trapped areas rebounded to at or above pre-trapping densities within 1 year after trapping.
Oh my gosh.
But
how is that possible?
This is the point. That's the point that I was getting to, and I almost got out of order and spoiled it, that it wasn't through individuals immigrating to the site. It was through compensatory reproduction.
Isn't nature interesting?
Yeah, the 10% of those coons that they left back, that those 1 to 2 coons per square mile were able to produce such large litters with high survival rates that population recovered within a year.
So the 30 square miles reduced the population by 90%, and then in 1 year, it's right back. So to me, that screams a few things. One, in some contexts, you can be really effective at lowering the density of raccoons.
For sure.
No question. But two, regardless of what scale that is, you need to repeatedly do it year after year.
Absolutely.
They didn't do it for multiple years, so it's not clear if that would continue on. But really, we don't have any. I mean, I don't know why the compensatory mechanism would burn out. We'll just say it that way.
Well,
like that mechanism, it shouldn't deplete. It should get stronger.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I think that's an interesting point because in studies with other species, and I'm most familiar with the coyote stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've shown that, and that really interests me to do this with raccoons because we've shown in several of the coyote studies, particularly the one that I did as a PhD student and the one John Kilgo did on the Savannah River site, they found that first year after they trapped coyotes on Savannah River site, fawn survival shot way up. On my study site, fawn recruitment shot way up on one of my sites. But then in year 2, when we trapped, we found almost no benefit for fawn recruitment, whereas Kilgo found that fawn survival went back down as well. And so it kind of led us to conclude, based on these couple of studies that we have so far, that year 1 looks great. And there's other studies where year 1 after coyote removal looks great, but they haven't trapped or shot or whatever they did to reduce the population for multiple years. And so that kind of led us to conclude, well, maybe this is one of those things that if we do it for a long time, we don't get those like beginner gains, right? It's like you hear them referred to in the gym a lot as beginner gains. When you first start running or lifting weights, you grow a lot, you get a lot of benefit fast, but then longer term, that starts to get diminishing.
Well, I think a lot of people that have hunted a new property or naive property before probably can appreciate this kind of thing, right? That first year is often crazy, and then even though you may not have less turkeys or less deer or whatever you're hunting, it does seem to get a little bit harder.
Yeah.
Like the ones that are remaining are a little bit smarter.
Well, you got to think about that. When you reduce the population by 90%, what is it about the remaining 10% that kept them from getting killed? You just on a mass scale selected for all the trap shy individuals. Who knows?
They pass on their genetics. Who knows? Well, I mean, I think that's why I was saying earlier, it does paint a positive light on trapping in that you could be really effective, at least in that 1 year.
Yeah.
But it also, the counter is, well, you're going to have to do it every year. But you and I both talked about, and I think the way that you said it was that Dwayne Elmore really changed your mind about how you think about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he did me too. When I think we probably had the same moment.
Yeah.
That he changed both of our minds about this. But the same thing is true for other stuff, habitat work. You have to repeatedly do it.
Yeah.
So that's not necessarily a problem.
And some of it is fairly expensive too, and time consuming. But we still recommend doing it every year. Right. So that's up to people to choose. What we're trying to do is to give you the information to decide whether or not that's worth it to you. Yeah. Now, one of the questions.
Well, go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the questions that I got on Instagram about this, and I'm just going to put it to you, and we can work through it together. Is, okay, let's just say 90%. That's close enough to 100%, right? Let's just say that the raccoons were effectively gone from that area. And let's say that, just for simple math again, that raccoon nest depredation accounts for the loss of 50% of our nest on the landscape, right? So I had a follower ask me in response to that post, well, if we get rid of 100% of the predators that result in 50% of our nest losses, why does nest success not go back up by 50%?
Well, I think the way you phrased it right there, the first thing is we don't know if it does, but usually that is there's not a 1-to-1.
Yeah.
So in that study that you covered showing the 90% plus decline of raccoons, we don't know what happened to turkeys in it. So I want to make that clear. And I think that was one of the things I was about to say. We don't know if that translates into vital rate. And the reason that you and I are both careful about that is because that we don't understand all of the compensatory mechanisms at play, which probably differ all over the place. But based on the particular context, and may even on the same place over time. So that's why we're really careful to extrapolate beyond the data. And I think that's important, and that's our role to make sure that we do that, and that we don't promise people are going to get something out of it that they may or may not get.
Right.
So one compensatory mechanism that is at play is what allowed the raccoon population to rebound. That's compensatory reproduction. We've talked about that It's basically they expanded reproductive effort or reproductive efficiency by having more of the offspring survive, or it could be some combination of those. Probably is.
There's more corn piles per coon left on the landscape.
You know what? The researchers were carrying around that pocket corn. That's what it was.
Hey, I've got a really cool point to make on that one in just a second.
Oh gosh. So, but the other thing is we don't know what proportion of the raccoon predation on nests is actually predation or scavenging, or that the fate of the
like
nest,
Dr. Collier talked about on the podcast,
or that the fate of the nest isn't going to still fail, basically, without being predated. So in other words, if a raccoon eats it at day 2 or doesn't eat it at day 2, that doesn't mean it won't get destroyed by some other reason or failed for some other reason, on down the line. So they often don't equate 1-to-1 because there's a lot of interactions going on and a lot of mechanisms playing out that aren't necessarily obvious to us.
Nothing in nature happens in a vacuum. Everything that we do affects something else other than the direct intended effect that we had when we implemented that action, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's just like another example would be we burn to increase quality brooding cover, right? But burning also may attract other, species of non-game, let's just say like non-game, like small mammals or something that are food sources for predators.
Mm-hmm.
So theoretically, we've increased the carrying capacity for predators in that area that we've burned. So we're going to get some benefit of doing that for turkeys, but maybe we draw a few more bobcats in and lose another hen on the nest, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's all these, and I don't say that we don't quit burning because of that, but we just know that it's not a perfect world where everything that we do with a certain intention only affects the thing that we intended to, right?
Right. So I have a couple of studies that I wanted to highlight. I think we still need to give some specifics on why we pretty consistently, I guess,
Focused
shade
on
do what?
focused on habitat.
Yeah, we kind of hedge our bets on habitat, at least habitat first. To be clear, I think I have been open about this. I'm not discouraging anybody from trapping, but I don't think that it's a good idea for that to take the place of habitat. So if you're doing both, then the quail study is a good example of that. They could augment one another. That's fine. But I don't. I'm always careful to say, and I know you are because I've heard you say it a whole bunch of times. I'm always careful to say habitat and then predator trapping.
Yeah.
In that order. And again, the study that you shared earlier is a good example of why we say that. But I thought it would be interesting to do a few things. One, I just wanted to make it clear what kind of data we do have. So why would we be more comfortable? And I think a lot of people know this out there already. And I think we've said it to some degree in various conversations we've had on the air. We know that if the vegetation characteristics become very poor, that the species of interest, and quail are a great example of this, but the species of interest doesn't flourish in that area, may not even exist.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's why we don't see quail in the Walmart parking lot very often. You might catch one crossing it every once in a while, but that we have good data from habitat change showing that when something changes dramatically for the negative, that the species often goes away.
Mm-hmm.
The same can be said, and I have seen this play out several times for quail in particular. That one is such a good canary in the coal mine for this stuff. If you get someone, even if they're an island where they have no one around them doing this, if you get them thinning and burning and disking and promoting high quality early succession that promotes high habitat quality for quail, they pretty much are going to show up.
Yeah.
I don't even understand
maybe not in
how.
huntable numbers, but you'll hear some whistling.
Yeah. So, that's a pretty clear indicator. The other thing, and we have a lot of this specific to turkeys. Turkeys select for certain types of vegetation and avoid other ones.
Mm-hmm.
We see that commonly. There is habitat use. There's nest site selection. We have shared the Johnson et al. Paper, or I did I put out a video that Craig Harper did from the Tennessee nesting study, or the turkey study, that had nesting and brooding stuff. There was really strong selection. We can link that video if you want to watch that again. A great reference for what nesting cover looks like. There was super strong nest site selection for certain vegetation characteristics, and same for brooding. And we see that with adults. Cohen et al. Showed that in Goulds, where they were strong selection for riparian areas in turkeys that they translocated. They had a follow-up study, it was Ulrey et al., that showed intense selection for pine woodlands. Right? I had a student, Don Chance, that we did some really cool thinning and burning and herbicide work, and he looked at fine scale habitat use by turkeys, and there was strong selection for certain suites of vegetation characteristics.
Think about Craig Harper's findings that we always discuss on here.
Yeah, I just shared a post like 2 or 3 days ago from another Mark Turner, one of your former graduate students, who's now a PhD student with Craig Harper, where they showed selection for certain characteristics associated with thinning and burning treatments in Tennessee. So all this to say, and some of these show changes in success for individuals that chose something and not the other.
Right.
That's not as good as the population level stuff that we want to get at with manipulation. But my point is, we have tons of data showing habitat selection and that there's variation in success associated with that selection.
Yeah.
Right. Nelson et al. Did the same thing with broods, and it was pretty cool. I think you showed me this paper. It was one of, I think, Chamberlain's students, right? That the broods changed habitat selection as they aged.
Yeah.
So they started out in certain types of vegetation, and then as they got older, they started selecting different things.
Yeah, they're finding what they need.
Yeah. So that all of those are good indicators that habitat matters, and we know when we don't have any habitat, we don't have the species usually, with rare exceptions. And then, all of that selection data shows you that they have preferences, and then when we try to model it, we can show that individuals that picked a good thing, or actually, we can't really say whether
they picked one thing.
Good, yeah, we know there's variation in terms of if you nested in this kind of cover, this is your success, versus that kind of cover, this is your success. That gives us the baseline to know what we think is good nesting cover, because we see the variation in nesting. I keep saying nesting, but it applies to whatever. We see the variation in success based on the choices that are made with all the tagged individuals. And then that leads us to say, okay, this must be good nesting cover. So let's promote more of that. Well, that's not that far of a leap. But we still don't have, okay, this is what we think is good nesting cover. let's go manipulate that on the landscape and then demonstrate the population's nesting success increased by
Right.
X% because of it.
Right.
Those are, that's where the hole is.
Yeah.
Which I think is important because I would like to know and be able to tell people this is what you're going to get out of it if you increase nesting quality by this much.
Yeah.
Here's how much you're going to get.
Right.
And I can't say that, but I have a high degree of confidence what good nesting cover is based on all of these studies showing that variation, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of easier to do for quail, which is why we have so many quail papers on it, because they live in a smaller area. So manipulating that and having them live in it is easier.
Right. And they're also so responsive comparatively. The canary, right? Like I just said a minute ago, there's going to be population level consequences, because every one of those little snacks is, vulnerable to everything that could kill something.
Yeah.
So if we look at the predator aspect and we start to go down that same road, it's fairly common in the literature that animals respond to predation risk by avoiding it. And that could be proactively or reactively. And what I mean by that is they may set up their home range in places that are less risky, or they may stop using an area or avoid using an area after they interact with a predator.
Yeah.
Anybody that's hunted a turkey knows what I'm talking about.
Right.
Right. So we have that data. However, nesting, from what I could tell from scouring the literature, nesting, the stronger indicator of nesting is not how abundant predators are, but what the vegetation characteristics are.
Yeah.
In an area, and I'm not talking about turkeys. I'm just talking about in general. So there also there were a couple of interesting studies again from Chamberlain's lab and Patrick Whiteman, which we've asked. He said he would come on soon. We've got a topic we want to cover with him. We'll try to get him on. But he's a postdoc with Chamberlain. They published a paper that was kind of looking at turkeys and coyotes simultaneously. And that is essentially what they found in that study, is that turkey habitat use and coyote habitat use did not overlap very closely. So they were proactively, I guess, selecting different types of vegetation. The coyotes in their study were hunting basically shrubby, thick, dense areas, and the turkeys were avoiding that. Right? So that pine stand that didn't get burned, that's got a thick mid-story of shrubs.
Yeah, just stuff that turkeys aren't going to walk through.
Right.
They're just going to nest on the edge of it, but not walk through it.
Yeah. So I also grabbed a clip of their introduction because it kind of said what I was trying to coalesce from various studies, and they already had them cited. So they cited a few studies, but they also were really interested in that study and in talking about others that have focused on how wild hunting behavior responds to hunting pressure.
Yeah.
And most of that has been on proactive movements, and what Whiteman, their paper showed some reactive stuff where they were trying to look at whether or not turkeys would stop using an area essentially after an interaction, or if they changed their behavior as a response to that. And as far as I can tell, they didn't find strong evidence of that reactive behavior. But what he said, or what they said in the text, was that most of these other studies that looked at hunting pressure concluded that the presence of hunters generally had little impact on the size of the home range or the daily distance traveled. But they did avoid some areas that were really intensively hunted. So like the field that gets hunted every time, or right at, near the entrance of the WMA or whatever, those kinds of areas are generally avoided. But some of the general characteristics about how they behave that would be more proactive are not responsive.
Yeah.
So I guess the point I'm trying to make is we have some information that there is behavioral adjustments responding to predators, just like we do with habitat, right? But we don't have some of that other middle ground information, right? That we have with habitat that allows us to be more comfortable to say, yeah, this is what good nesting cover looks like, so you should promote that.
Yeah.
As opposed to,
well, also,
like we need to see some studies where we show the relative abundance of predators across the landscape, and that hens are more or less successful in different areas. That would kind of get us closer, where we'd feel more confident, I guess, talking about the predator issue. We know that predators are a problem, but it still doesn't allow us to take that step forward that trapping is going to solve that problem.
Yeah, to make a recommendation.
So another thing that I found interesting and remarkably difficult to quantify in the literature is, when I was talking about the behavioral responses to the predator, they're also confounded by habitat. Because the way they avoid predators is to choose a different suite of vegetation characteristics
of
the community, which is habitat.
Because habitat mediates everything.
Yes. So, like even when you're trying to quantify the role that predators are playing, it's still confounded by habitat. And I've said this before, and I think it is a good way to think about it. Although I think we need more data on this after trying to really find some good examples. The habitat management is an anti-predator strategy.
Yeah, sure.
Predators are often a limiting factor, or that's not the right way to put it. Predators are often the leading cause of mortality, but a proportion of that mortality is because the animal could not escape it with habitat, or the predator didn't have an alternative prey, like you brought up a minute ago. The field border is another good example where the arrangement is predisposing. It's not the predator that's the problem in that case.
Yeah.
Right. It's just a consequence.
Yeah. And I mean, something else that you and I have talked about before quite a bit is that we see sustainable or even growing populations of turkeys in areas that have no predator control ongoing. But
That's right.
And have lots of predator sign, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, my farm, not my farm, but the farm that I hunt, there's coyotes all over the place. There's lots of other predator tracks around. We've got the full predator community that you would expect in our part of the world present there. No predator control has been implemented to my knowledge for many years, and there's still tons of turkeys on it, right? Because and the habitat's great for turkeys, and that's probably why they're there. But you don't, conversely see areas that essentially have no turkey habitat, that have turkeys. Like I feel like habitat is the one common denominator. Sure, every now and then you find a turkey in a random place, but for the most part, you see areas and like there could be turkeys there, or there's not going to be turkeys there.
Right. Well, I think even when there's no habitat, and we can be facetious about that with the parking lot or whatever, but the same area often does not have predators.
Exactly.
And there aren't.
Yeah.
The game species. So I think that's a really good point. If you took away all the predators and you don't have the habitat, you're probably still not going to have them.
Yeah. I mean,
you can have them with the habitat and predators, which is, pretty much always the circumstance, right? So,
right.
Um, yeah, I feel like we're ranting now, and I don't mean it to come across like that, but
Yeah.
we just get attacked so much about this,
Yeah.
and
Well, I
and
mean,
I'm trying to give a balanced perspective on it, but we do put one before the other because we have good reason to.
yeah, that's right. And I mean, the simple example, you and I have talked about it a lot. You're probably tired of hearing it from me. And I think we may have mentioned it on the air one time before. But I mean, you just think about, creating an artificial environment where you have a turkey and a turkey predator like a bobcat. And you put them, let's just start out with an empty room. I mean, it could even be a big room the size of a gymnasium or something like that. If there's nothing else in there, right? It's just a big open empty space. You give that enough time to play out, both the turkey and the bobcat are probably going to try to focus on how to get out of there first. And they're going to be freaking out, but then they settle in. 10 times out of 10, the cat eats the turkey, right? But then you add some complexity to that environment. Let's say we throw a bunch of structure in there that the turkey can hide in, or we increase the size of the room that they're together in. Now the turkey can fly. Now the turkey can hide places. That's habitat, right? That's all we're
Mm,
doing with habitat, is we're trying to increase the number of options that a prey species like a turkey has available to itself to escape to and avoid predation.
yeah,
And then within each of those spaces, we're also creating hiding places. And those hiding
yeah,
places look a little bit different depending on if a turkey is our focal species, a white-tailed deer fawn is our focal species, or if we're focusing on the younger versus the older life stage of turkeys, right? That
mm,
changes over time. So a roost tree helps a 3-year-old gobbler stay out of a bobcat's clutches at night, whereas a little bush, a wax myrtle, might do the same thing to a 2-week-old poult that just roosted for the first time.
hmm,
So habitat mediates everything,
yeah.
basically.
Well, I think um, I think that kind of wraps it up, doesn't it? It's the example that you gave right there. The predator isn't the problem; it's the context.
Yeah,
And yeah, predators could be the leading cause of mortality because a hen doesn't have anywhere to nest that's good. So they
exactly.
all get eaten by predators. Well, the predator wasn't the problem,
Yeah,
even though that's what our data would show. Everyone got eaten by a predator. Oh, so that's the natural reactions to go trap all of them. And I think this is why we're also always really careful about it, because I think there are confounded in our interpretation of our data,
hmm,
and we do have strong evidence for what good habitat looks like based on what choices confer in the
yeah,
probability of success.
absolutely.
And we don't have necessarily as good a data with the predators, and neither of them do we have what you and I both want, is to quantify
Right,
the application of a technique and what the outcome is,
right.
and vital rates. So it's good stuff.
Well, we didn't even get to talk about two of my favorite things that I had written down for today. So I guess we'll have to get to that one next
Two of
time.
your favorite things?
Yeah, I can.
Can you tease us a
Well,
little?
one
Like,
of
give
them
us.
was related to feeding. That's our other
Oh,
favorite pet topic. But
how feeding affects predators, or
yeah, it was unintentionally reported in one of those studies that I looked up, the meta-analysis on the effectiveness of predator control and other methods to decrease human wildlife conflicts. One of the other tactics they looked at was diversion. Here I go again.
diversion?
Diversionary feeding.
So
So,
trying to get
so
basically putting food somewhere to get raccoons to eat else
yeah,
away from the
yeah.
nest.
To try to get the problem-causing animal go eat somewhere else, so you're not bothering me, right? Like when you send the kids to the kids' table at
Yeah.
Thanksgiving. Um, they stated that diversionary feeding. Um,
This is one of your favorite topics?
yeah, it had poor success, high cost, and it risked worsening conflicts. Um, because it was actually supplementing mesopredator populations.
Did they measure that? I need to go look at that.
And they noted that the distribution of carnivores is closely related to human food resources, and gave 3 citations. And they went on to say, generally feeding wildlife poses high risk of causing conflicts and should be avoided in most cases.
So
there
you remember
go.
that compensatory reproduction thing?
Yeah.
That's in part provoked by the release of resources to individuals.
Yeah.
Which is basically supplemental feeding.
Yeah, I thought that was super interesting, but I don't guess we have time to get into how coyotes could actually reduce your nest predation rate.
Well, I mean, I think
we can get into that one
probably,
another time.
We do have some. Well, maybe this. Maybe if we have a few people put in their rating of the podcast that they want to hear how coyotes reduce nest predation.
Yeah.
We have some studies, it sounds like, that you've dug up.
We have at least one.
Okay.
Yeah.
I got to hear about that.
Well, yeah, it was a pretty cool California study. They were looking at songbirds, but and their predators, and they generally found that when coyotes were around, the primary predators of the birds were not.
So mesocarnivore release.
Yeah, exactly right. And we're not talking about, one of my publications here. This thing was in Nature. So
yeah.
Cream of the crop.
Yeah. Really strong study, most likely.
Yeah. Well, and Nature likes to publish big picture stuff like that too. So
yeah. But it's also often a really strong experimental design and long-term data set, large scale often.
Yeah.
So I'm just assuming. I haven't looked at the paper.
Yeah. Can I close with one more quote that I wrote down today? It's more directly related to the topic.
Okay. Okay, go for it.
It was from one of those papers that we covered, one of the Quail ones, and I thought it was interesting. Nice little summary statement where they noted that among the many hypotheses thought to explain the decline in quail abundance throughout the U.S., such as land use change, extreme weather, predation, and loss and fragmentation of habitat, all those factors may influence such declines, but it has become clear that the major causative factor is habitat loss. And so they were speaking directly to quail there, but many people that that may have forgotten, they may not be as interested in quail, or they may just not have paid attention to that conversation. But when quail populations really started declining decades ago, the conversation closely mimicked the one that we're having related to turkeys right now, where everybody kind of had their pet hypothesis as to what was going on, and it was ultimately revealed that habitat was at the bottom of all of it. Sure, there are things that contribute, and we've talked about how predation, I mean, my God, it contributes for sure. We're not trying to say that it doesn't, but that habitat is oftentimes at the bottom of that. And once again, that's why we go back to it.
Well, and my closing point again, what happens when habitat quality declines substantially? The vital rates respond commensurately, and that's often because of elevated predation. So it makes sense that people would think when they see that predators are a problem.
Oh, that's a good point.
You don't take into consideration that habitat quality has declined, and that would return a higher predation rate, then it would look a lot like predators are the problem.
Absolutely.
When it was actually the habitat underlying cause that forced the increase in predation.
That's an outstanding point. Glad you made it.
I hate it's almost 2 hours into this.
Charlotte, clip that one out and go put it back at the beginning.
Yeah, that one needs to be in the front somewhere.
It does. It does.
We've got no one listening now.
That's the story of my life, though. Better late than never.
That's a point that I've been trying to make for 2 hours, and you just wouldn't let me get to it, would you?
It was my fault.
All right. Well, we've gone on and on and on about this.
I think that was a good one, though. I mean, I think people that really like to get down in the weeds, this is a very realistic representation of conversations that you and I have over this topic all the time. I mean,
we commonly counter each other, devil's advocate type stuff to challenge, push the envelope, right? Make you think. Mm-hmm. So, all right. Well, I guess we can close it there. Thanks everybody for listening. If anyone still is, we really appreciate it. And thanks for all the support. Look forward to keeping this coming to you, and hope to see some of you at the convention.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank y'all. Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.